Good evening. I'm Nima, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, October 12th. And tonight, we begin with tragedy north of Toronto, where police say two officers are dead after they were shot while responding to a disturbance call. The South Simcoe Police Service says the officers were shot while attending a home in the town of Innisfil, Ontario. The service has identified the officers as 33-year-old Constable Devin Northrup and 54-year-old Constable Morgan Russell. Ontario's police watchdog says the slain officers exchanged gunfire with a 23-year-old man, and the suspect is also dead. A police escort traveled through downtown Toronto this morning to the coroner's office. This was where police gathered to honor the two officers. Meanwhile, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister is urging the world's democracies to confront the rise of authoritarian powers across the globe. Chrystia Freeland says with Vladimir Putin's Russia on the march, the West must get serious about working more closely with like-minded allies. She's calling for countries like Canada to be willing to fast-track energy projects, even if it means taking a political hit at home. With winter coming, Ms. Freeland says Europe is about to learn firsthand the consequences of being dependent on Russia for its oil and natural gas. Economists with RBC say Canada's economy could fall into a recession as early as the first quarter of next year. But a new report says they expect unemployment to be less severe than in previous downturns. The economists say lower-income Canadians will likely be hit the hardest as purchasing power falls and debt servicing costs rise. They say higher prices and interest rates will shave $3,000 off the average household's purchasing power. All right, well, meanwhile, as Alberta vies to attract more young people to its communities, economists say it's a good thing for provinces to compete for workers. The Western province is targeting residents of Canada's most expensive cities. Now, this is in a campaign to attract workers with the promise of cheaper housing, better pay, and shorter commutes. University of Waterloo economics professor Mikhail Skuterud says the movement between provinces is good if it means workers are going to where they're needed the most. All right, staying in Alberta, where the freshly sworn-in Premier Danielle Smith has vowed to get right to work on one of her top priorities, healthcare reform. She intends to shake up the top tier of the province's health system within 3 months. She's accusing the management of Alberta Health Services of failing to provide the care expected during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ms. Smith says she will also replace Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the province's chief medical officer of health. As well, she vows to amend human rights laws to protect those who choose not to get vaccinated. All right, moving to the latest developments in the Hockey Canada scandal, which saw Canada's Minister of Sport promising change in the organization's new leadership. Pascal St-Onge says her department will work with Hockey Canada to ensure its new leadership works to implement cultural change. She also plans to review how Ottawa funds national sports organizations. Now, these comments come after Hockey Canada announced the resignation of its chief executive and board of directors following a series of scandals. Well, on the West Coast, an odorous invasive insect is thriving in parts of southern BC thanks to the hotter weather. The Invasive Species Council of BC says the brown marmorated stink bug has been reported more and more as summer-like weather extends into the fall months. The stink bug was first detected in British Columbia in 2015. The government describes it as a very serious pest that feeds on more than 100 plant species. The NHL regular season gets underway in Canada tonight. This with the Montreal Canadiens hosting the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Vancouver Canucks visiting the Edmonton Oilers. And there are 4 other games on tonight's slate. Boston is at Washington, Columbus is in Carolina, Seattle visits Anaheim, and Chicago meets the defending Stanley Cup champion Avalanche in Colorado. Well, about 177 Ukrainians fleeing Russian attacks on their country landed in Newfoundland last night. While there were joyful tears and hugs in St. John's International Airport as families were reunited, a sadness prevailed. Most of the Ukrainians who spoke with reporters last night said they were heartbroken and fearful for those back home after Russia launched lethal strikes in the country on Monday. Some said they were doing their best not to think about what would happen to them and their families if they were stuck in Ukraine. All right, we'll be right back. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at another way the pandemic has impacted healthcare with Dr. Abhishek Raut from Appletree Medical Group. He's going to take us through how there were 400,000 fewer mammograms done in Ontario during the pandemic and what the impact could be. So stay with us. Forum Daily News will be right back after a short break. The Ontario Medical Association says about 400,000 fewer mammograms were performed during the pandemic than originally anticipated. Now, although screenings have now returned to normal levels, the organization is warning that the temporary decrease in testing has led to cases of breast cancer that were further along when diagnosed. The association says survival rates of women with breast cancer decline if the detection of the disease is delayed. Well, with us now to discuss mammograms and the importance of detection is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Great to be here today.
So, medically speaking, just how significant of a warning is this from the Ontario Medical Association?
Well, I think it's fairly significant. If we look at breast cancer, it's one of the most common cancers amongst Canadian women, excluding non-melanoma skin cancers. It's the second leading cause of death from cancer in Canadian women. So we know that mammograms have really helped reduce breast cancer mortality. We've had several studies that show that it's reduced mortality by almost 40% since 1990. So that's a big number there. One study showed that mammography screening cuts the risk of dying by nearly in half. And in the United States, where a lot of these studies were done, that translated to about 432,000 breast cancer deaths that were prevented because of mammograms.
So, what kind of data do we have around the causes of breast cancer? Is it purely genetic, Dr. Raut?
I think that's a very good question. What we do find is there are genetic factors in there, and there are risks that we can't change. Getting older, genetic mutations like BRCA and BRCA2, reproductive history, or having denser breasts can also cause increased risk. And of course, family histories there of cancers. But there are risks we can change. So, not being physically active, being overweight, or having high obesity after menopause, taking hormonal medications, a reproductive history, so having a first pregnancy after the age of 30, or drinking alcohol, all can modify the risks. And certainly there are factors like this that affect risk in general.
It's good to know there are prevention factors, doctor. Now, we hear a lot about checking for lumps in the breast, but are there any other symptoms that women should be aware of when it comes to breast cancer?
Right. So what we typically notice is that sometimes someone will notice a new lump in the breast or underarm, perhaps even a thickening or swelling. Sometimes you'll see irritation on the skin, redness or flaky skin around the area as well. Sometimes there is nipple discharge or change in the size or shape of the breast. And finally, any pain in the area. So when we have these symptoms, there's certainly causes for concern. They could be conditions outside of cancer, but it's certainly worth investigating when you have these symptoms here.
Now, on that point, considering there are some ways to check for lumps and other symptoms at home or with a partner, when do mammograms become necessary, Dr. Raut?
Right. So the concern is breast cancer can be quite asymptomatic as well, meaning you absolutely have no symptoms and still have breast cancer. So mammograms are helpful tests that are designed to screen asymptomatic individuals. And if you are at particular high risk because of the factors we had mentioned above, that's where mammograms work quite well to capture those as well. And that's why they're so essential and part of our arsenal for against breast cancer.
All right, Dr. Raut, what are some other types of cancers that Canadians can and should get checked for?
Right. So lung cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer and the leading cause of death in Canada. So if someone was a smoker, had a 20-year pack history of smoking, it's very important that they contact their doctor to screen for lung cancer. Colorectal cancers are the third most common cancer in Canada. The FIT screening stool tests are available and can actually be done at home. So you can mail out back to the lab there. Prostate cancer is the most common cancer for Canadian men. Prostate screening includes typically a digital rectal exam as well as a prostate blood test there. And then finally, cervical cancers, which can be screened by pap testing as well.
All right, Dr. Raut, a quick minute left here, but any advice for people who may be wary visiting hospitals and doctors for these checkups, especially following the pandemic?
All right, I definitely understand and empathize with that reluctance. I think we've seen wave after wave of COVID-19, and then we've had a few other issues we'd have to deal with as well. So people are understandably afraid, but certainly I think it's very important to get those screenings and checkups done. Keeping in mind these screenings for cancers save lives. So please talk to your doctor about these screening tests that you can do for your health.
Always an important conversation. Dr. Raut, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to be taking a look at the fight for sex work law reform across Canada. We're going to be speaking with Miss Jennifer Clamen, National Coordinator for the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform. And we're going to be discussing the ongoing case in Ontario Superior Court and the harm that sex workers face under the current laws that force them into unsafe conditions. And of course, we'll have more news from around the world after that, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily News. A landmark case brought before Ontario Superior Court is challenging Canada's laws around sex work. The Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform and several individuals are arguing that the current laws violate provisions of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which in turn forces sex workers into unsafe conditions. The groups are asking that several sections of the Criminal Code be deemed unconstitutional. These sections criminalize advertising sexual services and communicating to buy or sell sexual services. Jenn Clamen with the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform says there shouldn't be any criminal laws that are specific to sex work. Ms. Clamen joins us now to give us the latest updates in this case. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having us.
Now, 5 days of arguments for this case came to a close on Friday. So what were the main takeaways from last week's hearing in Ontario Superior Court, and what are the latest updates in this case?
It was a week full of energy from community. There were a lot of sex workers who showed up from across the country and locally to watch the case. A lot of people have really high stakes in the case. Over the past 7 years, sex workers' rights have been violated because of the new laws that were implemented in 2014. For sex workers in the case, it's really important that these violations are recognized and that their experiences of the laws are placed at the center of the discussion, and that we need to listen to those experiences.
Now, your group is arguing that the criminalization of sex work in Canada is, as you said, taking away the rights of sex workers and forcing them into unsafe conditions. So what does that look like through the lens of a sex worker in Canada?
Sex workers, because of the current laws, are forced to work in a context of criminalization. And what that means is that at any moment, and in all moments, sex workers and clients and third parties, the people who work with or for sex workers, are all avoiding detection from law enforcement. And what that means is that sex workers are forced into isolation. And though some people don't recognize, but when you're in isolation, it means you have a lack of access to supports should you need them. It means sex workers are not able to meaningfully communicate consent with clients because doing so is illegal. Sex workers are limited, if not prevented, from accessing health and social and legal services. And so the total context of criminalization actually puts sex workers in a context where they cannot access the means that they need to be able to protect their health and safety.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how these safety concerns of sex workers in Canada are being handled by authorities and police who are in charge of protecting our civilians?
Well, I think people take for granted what it means to be criminalized. And so if you can imagine or understand that when police are mandated to arrest clients, third parties, and some of whom are sex workers as well, everybody's avoiding law enforcement, and it really creates an antagonistic relationship with law enforcement. And so when people need access to law enforcement, should they ever need access to law enforcement, they don't necessarily have that access. And this is even more pronounced for communities that are over-surveilled and underprotected by law enforcement. So Indigenous women on the street, Black women, racialized women, migrant women, trans women, communities that are already over-policed and under-surveilled, who are targeted because of criminalization, because people who are predators know that sex workers won't go to police. And so it puts a target on sex workers' back, and they're unable to contact police as a result of the criminalization.
And we know sex work has been decriminalized in other countries, including New Zealand, a lot of countries in Europe. So what kind of impact has this made on the overall safety and well-being of sex workers there? Just a quick minute and a half left here.
Yeah, it's a huge impact. So in New Zealand, you have a context where sex workers are recognized under labor standards. There's a sex worker recently who went to a human rights tribunal and was awarded $250,000 for a sexual assault in her workplace. That wouldn't have been recognized as sexual assault in a context where all sex workers considered sexual assault. And so a decriminalized context means that sex workers have access to mechanisms to improve their working conditions, and to be able to fight for their rights as workers.
All right, Ms. Clamen, a quick 45 seconds left here. I really want to get this question in. So there are concerns around sex trafficking and the sexual exploitation of people. So how might the decriminalization of sex work impact these ongoing issues in our country?
Absolutely. The exploitation is actually the reason that sex workers brought forward this case, is because sex workers want that exploitation and violence in their lives to stop. When you have a criminalized industry, it actually allows exploitation to flourish. And so decriminalization really allows the identification of real violence rather than wasting a lot of resources on the sex industry where there might not be any violence.
All right, Ms. Clamen, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at the major headlines and news stories from around the world. Ukraine's largest nuclear plant loses external power after Russian missile strikes. Iran suffers a major disruption to its internet service. The UN urges the world to respond faster to flood-hit Pakistan. And it seems that TikTok is looking at opening warehouses in the U.S. For these stories and more, stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back. Stay with us. Russian missile attacks have caused a crippled nuclear plant in Ukraine to lose all external power for the second time in just 5 days. The Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia plant suffered a blackout when a missile damaged an electrical substation and shut down its emergency power. Ukraine's state nuclear operator says Russia is increasing the risk of a radiation disaster. This is because electricity is needed to operate the plant's critical safety systems. All 6 of the reactors were stopped earlier due to the war, but they still require power to prevent them from melting down. All right, well, meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin said today that Moscow is ready to resume gas supplies to Europe. Now, this would be through a link of the Germany-bound Nord Stream 2 pipeline under the Baltic Sea. Speaking at a Moscow Energy Forum, Mr. Putin again charged that the U.S. was likely behind the recent explosions, which ripped through both links of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline and one of the 2 links of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This caused a massive gas leak, taking them out of service. The U.S. has previously rejected similar allegations by Mr. Putin. Now, speaking of the U.S., President Joe Biden says there will be consequences for Saudi Arabia. This comes as his administration begins reevaluating America's relationship with the kingdom. The comments follow an announcement by the Riyadh-led OPEC Plus alliance of oil-producing nations, which said that it would cut oil production. Mr. Biden said in a CNN interview yesterday that he was weighing action against the Saudis, but he declined to detail potential next steps. The OPEC Plus production cut is expected to help Russia pad its coffers as it continues its nearly 8-month war in Ukraine. Well, demonstrators are back on the streets again in Iran, which has suffered a major disruption in internet service following calls for renewed protests. Rallies are still taking place across the country, weeks after the death of Mahsa Amini. The 22-year-old woman had been detained by the country's morality police. Advocacy group NetBlocks says internet traffic in Iran has dropped to roughly 25% compared to the usual peak. All right, turning to comments by a top public health official in Africa who says the continent must plan to respond effectively to disease outbreaks without outside help. Ahmed Ogwell is the acting head of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and he said that assistance often never materializes. And African nations must plug gaps to respond to outbreaks such as Ebola in Uganda. African officials are meeting in Uganda to plan cross-border cooperation over the Ebola outbreak in the country, which was declared on September 20th. The United Nations is appealing to the world to speed up its response and help 33 million people in flood-ravaged Pakistan. The UN says only 20% of a fundraising target has been met since its launch last week. Officials are concerned about health, nutrition, shelter, and food security. This is for the vast swaths of the population who have lost their crops, homes, and livestock in the floods. Moving to Britain now, where the economy is shaking after the country's central bank ruled out extending an emergency debt buying plan. Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey says a program to buy government bonds will end on Friday as scheduled. The program was introduced last month to stabilize financial markets. The British government appeared to blame the independent central bank for the country's current economic turmoil. It is suggesting it is primarily the result of the bank's failure to raise interest rates quickly enough. Looks like TikTok plans to operate warehouses in the U.S., like the ones run by Amazon and Walmart. The social media platform has posted several job listings on LinkedIn. It is looking for workers to help it develop and grow its Fulfillment by TikTok shop. Now, this would be to accommodate sellers using the app. The listing suggests that TikTok plans to provide warehousing, delivery, and item return options to sellers. But so far, the company isn't commenting. Insider intelligence reports that shopping on social media sites, known as social commerce, is a $37 billion market in the U.S., and it's led by Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram. NASA says its Save the World test was a smashing success. The DART spacecraft plowed into a small, harmless asteroid millions of kilometers from Earth 2 weeks ago, and days of telescope observations have shown that it succeeded in shifting the asteroid's orbit. The first ever test was designed to see if a killer rock could be nudged out of Earth's way. Some good news there. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.